Hey, Campfire crew, let's get it on.
Unlucky Assailant, submitted by Harmthuria. This took place way back in 2007, and I only remember because it happened on St. Patrick's Day. I lived in Oshawa, Ontario at the time, and my friends and I went out for the day, as we did every year since we turned 19. That's the legal drinking age in Ontario, Canada. My friends and I had gone out to the same bar, Le Scratch, every year for St. Patrick's, and any other time we wanted to have a drink because it was, at the time, the only bar with enough pool tables that we were almost guaranteed one on that day, even without a reservation. This time, however, we did make a reservation because we were also going to celebrate a mutual friend's little sister. That's right, she's born on March 17th, and we were going to celebrate her like we did every friend. That's to say, we were going to get her drunk. But her boyfriend and big sister were there too, so it's not like we were going to hurt her afterwards. What we did was give the birthday boy or girl drinks that he or she didn't know would get them hammered fast. You know what a zombie is? She didn't. We had a lot of fun with our friends that way, and they had fun with me back in 2004. The first thing she drank, we'll call her Dawn, was a couple of birthday shots. The first being whatever you wanted, whatever you thought would be a good drink as you were growing up, and seeing other people drink their favorite drink. Dawn ordered a shot of rum because she loves Captain Jack Sparrow. And the second was the birthday surprise. You didn't get to choose that one. What it is simply a shot glass filled with half water and half Tabasco sauce. The water is only to thin out the sauce and make it easier to swallow so you can't spit it out. And we would take bets on who would throw up. God, I miss those days. Anyway, enough backstory. The incident happened an hour or so after her birthday shots. It was just 7 of us, playing pool on one table because that's all that was available. And there was this one guy who had a pair of Jordans on who kept talking to Dawn, but not in an aggressive way, so we let him be. Keep in mind, these were the first Jordans I had ever seen that weren't in a store, so it was easy for me to examine them and remember what they looked like. They were white with a purple tongue. This would become handy later. The guy hitting on Dawn made us laugh, thinking about how he was going to strike out with her. The thing is, since she was getting lightheaded from all the drinking, she kept walking away from him. But she wasn't walking out of the bar, she just kept taking a few steps to her right, hoping that he wouldn't follow suit. But he always did. While that was going on, it was my turn to play, so I took my shot, missed, and went to sit back down. As I turned to my right to take a French fry off a platter, I noticed that Dawn was leaning away with her hands in his face, and his left hand on her breast, and his other behind her head trying to hold her so he could kiss her. I immediately got up and rushed over as 2 other friends did the same. We didn't start fighting him. We just pulled the 2 of them apart and rather loudly told him to fuck off. This grabbed the attention of a bouncer nearby, and he came over to check on the commotion. The guy didn't say anything. He just had his hands up like someone was pointing a gun at him, you know? The 3 of us told the bouncer what happened, and he just told the guy to go back to his table. I was pissed he wasn't thrown out, as that should be a minimum for sexual assault, but I digress. Things didn't end there. Dawn got consoled by her boyfriend, and we tried to keep the fun conversation going while we were playing, and that's pretty much what transpired for the next half hour. It took about that long before Dawn had calmed down enough to order another drink, and for things to be light and breezy again. I forgot about the guy for a while and just kept shooting the shit with my friends, playing pool, and I didn't notice when Dawn went to the bathroom because she felt nauseous. We all laughed a little, as this had happened to all of us on our birthdays, at least a couple of times before we learned just how much of a tolerance for alcohol we really had. But for some reason, I started to feel uneasy. My friends will tell anyone who listens how they think I'm paranoid, but on that night, it paid off. I was just standing there holding my pool cue, and I started feeling really uneasy about Dawn walking off by herself. I saw her sister sitting in her own boyfriend's lap without a care in the world, but I couldn't shake the feeling. So I put my cue down with my left hand on my stomach to not draw the wrong attention to myself as I left for the bathroom. The way the bathrooms were built in this bar, the ladies' room was at the end of a short hallway, while the door to the men's room was next to it on the right, and there was usually a bouncer there as well. But there wasn't at that minute. I decided to chance it and opened the door to see if I could see Dawn inside. And lo and behold, she was on her knees in front of the toilet, driving the bus. Now I felt better, but when I turned my head to look out of the bathroom towards where I was going to walk, I saw shoes behind her. The same kind of white Jordans the guy from earlier was wearing. I didn't hesitate at that point. I went and kicked the stall door in, and for those of you who are listening who are wondering, the lock was only a little latch to hold the door shut. It wasn't like it was a bank vault. That little metal latch really didn't do anything against a kick. I tried to grab the guy and take him out of the stall, but the door closed inwards, and there were 2 people in the stall in the first place. So we struggled and wrestled, but since his jig was up, he eventually gave up and let me take him out. I slammed him against a wall opposite the stall and shoved my left forearm in his throat. I wanted to tear his head off. He tried to scream to get me to let him go, but then a bouncer who heard the ruckus walked over. The guy barely got a word out before I told him to check the stall. The bouncer didn't understand, but he didn't try to split us up, and I repeated, "Check the stall." He went in, and I relaxed my grip a little bit because I wanted to check on Dawn as well. Turns out, I stopped him halfway through. Her skirt was lifted up, and her panties were pulled down, and she was unconscious. Thankfully, though, this guy's pants weren't undone. The bouncer half-assed pulled up Dawn's panties, and obviously he lowered her skirt. He then took her in his arms like a bride and asked me which table we were at. I told him, and he said he'd be back in a minute. The movie geek that I am, I had a nerdgasm right then and there, and I pummeled that guy. Any of you who think violence isn't the answer, wait till something similar happens to you. I don't wish it on anybody, but it was necessary in this case. I didn't go too far with the beating, though. The guy dropped fast to protect himself, but that didn't stop me from dislocating the right side of his jaw. Then I stopped and quickly left before any witnesses came over, and thankfully none did. That was divine intervention in my opinion. I went back to my table, and the bouncer was there with 2 other bouncer/security guys. The cops were called, and I had to give a statement. And our fun abruptly came to an end, but no one blamed me. Dawn's sister didn't leave her side. She just kept holding her tightly. When their mom came and I explained what had happened, she thanked and hugged me for what felt like several minutes. I didn't object. I just let her vent her feelings however she wanted to. She only let go of me when she saw the cops take the guy away in handcuffs. I didn't know why he wasn't already taken outside at that point, but he hadn't been. The mom ran towards him and started yelling, "How could you? You animal! I'll kill you!" My friends and I ran to her and helped the cops take her away. They weren't going to arrest her for this mild assault. They understood why she did it, and they just wanted to keep her at bay. She was still yelling, so I tried to yell over her in a soothing manner, if that was possible. I told her, "Mrs. Blank, he's not worth it." She turned and saw me, and that's when she started bawling. Turns out she had been assaulted when she was in her early 20s, and no one had helped her. I don't think her friends didn't mean to not help, but that's what happened. I was feeling rather uncomfortable at that point because I wasn't a superhero. I was just a guy who got lucky, if you will. He, on the other hand, wasn't. I don't know what happened to that guy because we never talked about that night since, and I moved in mid-November of that year. But I hope for his sake, we never meet again. Intruder by Single Joke. This is a story from a while back when I was 6 or 7. I don't remember the age I was, but I remember the incident very clearly. It was when me and my family were living with our grandparents at the time, as they had a very big house. It was 5 stories high, and only the second floor was occupied, while the whole house was left untouched except the first floor. The rest of the floors were empty, with just big hallways and old wooden doors. The house was an old house with those old interlocking metal chain gates at every floor, which were locked by chains by my grandfather. And the house or complex was located in the middle of the main market of my city. Before 9 p.m. at night, the market was full of life and sounds of vehicles. But after 9 or 9:30, the whole market shut down and the place became like a vacant graveyard, and it stayed that way until 6:30 in the morning. And this is all important for later. One night, the whole market shut down as usual, and my grandfather started chaining the metal gate. Everything was ordinary till then. And after me and all my family went to sleep around 10:30 or 11, my grandfather heard the sound of someone fidgeting with the lock and the chain. Not the one that opened to the downstairs, but the one that opened the gate to upstairs. And my grandfather shouted my name, "Hey, don't play with the gate, go to sleep." My grandfather swore that he heard the footsteps of someone running upstairs with the lock loudly hitting the steel gate and creating a loud sound. After hearing that, my grandfather grabbed a stick and torch and walked to the door and shone the torch down. He swore he saw someone's leg, and he screamed, waking every one of us up. My mom rushed over to see what happened to my grandfather. He had fallen backwards and leaned on the wall, scared as the torch fell on the ground. He was scared because in that house, he had allowed someone to rent, and the guy lived there for a few years, after which he killed himself in that same room my grandfather had been shining the torch in. He killed himself by hanging. My grandfather had found the body 3 days after him dying, and that incident really shook him after that. Roughly 12 or 13 years after he saw someone in his house, which really fucked with his mental health and made him paranoid for the last few years of his life. Still, after that, everyone swore they also heard sounds of footsteps, sounds of dragging, and of things falling down from the upstairs through the air ducts. After a period of time, maybe 3 or 5 years, my grandfather and grandmother lived in the same house, alone. He said sometimes at night he saw ghosts and snakes, and there was one last bit of evidence I had that let me know that the shit that happened so long ago was true. For a few days, me and my cousins were staying there, and 2 days in a row, we found the second floor door opened and the chain on the stairs. After that, when we were selling the house to someone else, me and my siblings went up to check the floors one last time. We found a door leading to the balcony broken, and there was pieces of wood scattered all throughout the 3rd floor and the stairs to the 4th floor, which had been chained and locked up. Stalker Caller Was My Male Friend by Wiggles 1004. Honestly, this is going to sound like a terrible movie. Listen, I was naive. Despite my abusive childhood, I was still too trusting. Looking back now, I'm like, duh, of course it was that asshole. In the end, I'm just so grateful I wasn't hurt physically. I, a 37-year-old female, was 18 at the time, living on my own in a studio apartment on the 1st floor of a very shady apartment complex. I have at least 4 creepy stories from just being a resident there for only 6 months. This story isn't one of those 4, but the fact that I was 18 years old and living on my own on the 1st floor is important to know. Let me start at the end. I was at a downtown street party with my sister. As we waded through the crowd, I saw Peter, not his real name by the way, amongst other partygoers. I hadn't seen or spoken to him for a few years. The second I saw him that night, the creepy calls and the voice came flooding back to me. That's when I realized that the creep that had been calling me one night was Peter. He was 21 at the time, and as I mentioned, I was 18. We were co-workers at a restaurant that we would have the same shifts a couple of times a week. We were just starting to get to know each other, and one night we were talking on the phone. It was storming, and I joked that weird stuff always happens on nights like that. I didn't think too much of it. We hung up around 10 p.m., and not 10 minutes later, I got a call from a private number. I answered it, and the caller said in a raspy male voice, "I'm watching you." I hung up immediately. They called again, but I didn't answer. And they kept on calling. I finally answered it and said, "Leave me alone." And then the person said, "I'm watching you through your window." I yelled at him to leave me alone, and I hung up. I turned off my lights, checked the door lock, and huddled into a corner out of sight of the window. He kept calling. Then the calls stopped. I called Peter, scared out of my mind, but he didn't pick up. I figured he'd still be up, and that's why I called him, and I called a few more times. He finally called me back some 30 minutes later, and he told me the story about how his mom went to the emergency room for a heart condition. I frantically told him about the creepy caller, and he was adamant about coming to my apartment to stay the night, even though his mom was in the hospital. He did spend the night on my couch, and the next morning he drove me to school. No discussion about what had happened the night before. Nothing. As time passed, I realized I didn't have romantic feelings for him at all. Unfortunately, he had romantic feelings for me. Needless to say, we had a falling out. Then we went our separate ways. That night haunted me for years. Among other things, mostly I was paranoid about having open curtains, and I was relieved when I moved from that apartment complex to a second-floor apartment. But that night continued to poison my mind. When I saw Peter at that party, after my matured brain finally made the connection, I wanted to confront him. But all I could do was leave the party and never see his awful face or hear his voice again. I really hope he didn't prey on other women the way he tried to with me. I'd like to mention that I don't recall, but I could have told him about the weird maintenance guy for the complex and how I suspected he entered my apartment when I was gone. Or I may have told him about a male stalker when I was 16, whom I never found out their identity. So he could have used this as fuel to try to frighten me into his arms. Well, Peter, thank God your plan didn't work. And let's never meet again. Never Going on a Night Ride Alone Again by MILF Lover. Earlier this last summer, I, a male of 16, got my driver's license for a 50cc moped, a common and popular thing here in Europe. I was so hyped to finally get to ride with my friends and explore places I couldn't have explored before without the moped. Everything went great for the first couple of days. One day, me and my friends were just out cruising around and having fun. It was a warm and sunny summer evening, so we decided to go ride on some smaller gravel roads in the countryside. We did that, and we were riding there for maybe about an hour until everyone had to get home but me. It was probably around 1 or 2 a.m. at that point, but I decided to stay out there and just ride around and listen to some music in my headphones. So I started riding towards this one small village surrounded by fields. There were a lot of farms there, so I rode a bit slower than usual so there wouldn't be any accidents with all the tractors and farm vehicles. After I got through the village and closer to a bigger road, it was completely dark outside. It had been a nice ride, and I decided to start heading home on this almost empty highway, even though the speed limit was 100 kilometers an hour. But you're not allowed to ride a 50cc moped on the highways. I did it anyway. Home was almost 30 kilometers away from where I was, and at that point, I was riding full speed to get home before my parents found out that I had been outside until 3. After I'd been riding for like 15 minutes, I saw a car stopped on the side of the road with the lights on, and it got me a bit creeped out, to be honest. I just pushed it out of my mind and kept going since I was almost halfway home. But after a few minutes of riding, I noticed the car from earlier was speeding up after me. And since I had a moped that only went like 80 or 90 kilometers an hour, the car caught up to me pretty quickly. When it did, the car started to pass me. But when it got beside me, I looked into it, and I saw a man at the wheel covered in blood, and he was looking straight at me with these crazy eyes, if you get what I'm saying. He was smiling at me, and I got very scared, and he rode alongside me probably for a minute, but it felt like hours, him just staring at me and looking at the road every once in a while. Then the man raised his other hand and waved goodbye to me before putting his finger on his lips and doing the shh thing. After that, he sped off and got off the highway onto a ramp to a smaller road. But when he did that, I saw that the car didn't even have license plates. That was a super creepy experience, and I don't know why the man was covered in blood, and why he had been parked on the side of an empty road at 3 a.m. But what I know for sure is that he is someone I never want to meet again. Dark Street Disappearing Act by The Shiny Limpopo. Several years ago, I had a very quick trip to Denver planned, 23 hours total. I was going to visit a friend before they moved away. I was young, broke, and working a crappy entry-level job, so it was the best I could do with my one day off. I went straight from work to the airport and got into DIA around 11 p.m. I was bunking on the couch of an old college friend, and they lived about 30 or 40 minutes from the airport. Fortunately, the light rail had recently been extended out to the airport, and my friend lived right near the line. I had taken the light rail often when living in Denver myself, but was not familiar with these newer additions. I barely made it to the train before it set off, grateful to not have to have waited around for another half hour at that time of night. It was nearing midnight as the train pulled into a brightly lit Union Station. I looked around for my connection, but it was nowhere to be found, not realizing that the connecting line was not there. Fortunately, I was able to flag down security, and they pointed me in the right direction. A few blocks away, there was another brightly lit station, separated by maybe 200 yards. Unlike the stations, there were hardly any lights, just some lights spilling in from either side where the train platform stood. I was only traveling with a backpack, so I was able to move quickly, moving out of Union Station and towards the other platform, hoping to make my next train. As I got further away from the station and my eyes adjusted to the darkness, I noticed a large figure standing in the middle of the sidewalk ahead of me. I quickly gauged my surroundings and realized there were no other paths unless I walked on the road. I decided to keep on the path and do my best to come across with a "I see you and I'm not scared" attitude. As I drew closer, I could make out a tall, muscular man, probably in his 20s or 30s. As I got closer, I made eye contact to let him know that I recognized his presence, and he was already staring right at me and mumbling to himself. As I passed by him, I could hear what he was mumbling. He was not speaking to me, but instead he was speaking about me, and as I walked past him, he began to follow. I began to walk faster, and he began to walk faster. All the while he was saying things like, "Oh, look at that body. She's so fine. I want to feel that body," along with other sexual and crude comments about me, all being muttered to himself. The second station was still another 100 yards or so away, and there was nowhere I could go in between. I pulled out my cell phone and rang my dad, desperate for him to answer. The call went to voicemail, but I pretended he had picked up. As soon as I began talking, the man spoke to me for the first time and said, "Oh, girl, I didn't mean you no harm," and the footsteps faded back. I kept up my fake conversation for a moment longer before looking back, and the guy was nowhere to be found. Like I mentioned previously, I had looked around for places I could escape and couldn't find any. I'm confident with his size, if he had done anything, I wouldn't have stood a chance. I burst into the light of the station and barely made my train, and ultimately missed my stop because I was so shaken up and had to ride the train back around. I finally rested my head on a pillow at my friend's house around 2 a.m., never to travel alone at night again. And whoever the disappearing man in the street was, let's never meet again. Were our camping neighbors trying to kill us? By rude association. I'm pretty sure we were involved in some weird couples killing spree last night. Me and my boyfriend's family are big campers. We try to go as often as possible and try finding different places depending on the weather and season. We booked a beautiful spot on a lake and had been anticipating the trip for months. So imagine our shock when we got to the site and discovered that the lake had flooded most of the campsite with the exception of ours, one next to it, and then one about 100 feet away. We didn't get to enjoy the lake because there was no beach access and the water was not safe. But we shrugged it off and set up our campsite as usual. At about 7 p.m., we saw a car pull into the campsite right next to ours. No big deal. We just went about our night. But I noticed that they were not in a hurry to set up camp. A middle-aged man and woman got out of the car. I'm a very observant and paranoid person, so I notice details that most people may not think anything of. In my mind, those campers arrived really late after check-in, and they didn't unload anything from their car. They didn't talk to each other, and they kind of just looked into our site in passing. Okay, no big deal, I thought. A bad storm hit us a few hours later, and we were literally holding down our tents while the couple next to us just sat in their car. No tent. I still thought that was odd, but my boyfriend said they probably were car campers and had the back seat set up to sleep in. Okay, that made sense, I guessed. But still, why go to a tent campground if you were a car camper? We eventually went to sleep and all was well until I was awakened by the sound of footprints in our vicinity. We all had been drinking, so the fact that this noise woke me up meant it was very close to our tent, and I sprang up and listened. I heard people walking up to our tent, and I saw the silhouette of a man through the fabric. In a state of panic, I unzipped the tent and looked outside. 2 people with red headband flashlights were standing about 7 feet from me, and I went back into the tent and grabbed my pepper spray air pistol. During all of this, my boyfriend woke up and asked me why I had opened the tent, and I explained what I had just seen. He reasoned that it was just the neighbors gathering firewood, and I couldn't shoot them for that. Immediately, the people walked away, and we heard nothing but silence. I took a moment to think that maybe I was being paranoid, and I was also a little hungover. I tried going back to bed, but could barely sleep. The next morning we woke up and the couple next to us had what looked like a tarp tied from one tree to another. I was thinking, what the fuck is that? I noticed that the man had the same khaki long pants that he had on the night prior, and the woman was also wearing her same clothes. That in and of itself isn't weird while camping. But what was weird is that they were not dressed for camping. It was hot, and the clothes they were wearing were not like anything you would wear in that environment. Long pants, almost like to protect you when going through the woods to hijack another site is what I thought. We went about our day, and I kept noticing that the couple didn't seem to interact with each other at all. They didn't talk, and started a fire in their fire pit for lunch, taking it very easy. Me and my boyfriend's family decided that due to the weather and the lake, we would head home early. Well, the couple next to us, who had just literally started a fire, immediately packed up and left just as we started to pack. They left in a hurry. We finished packing and got back to my boyfriend's parents' house and decided to stay there for a while. I told my boyfriend's parents about the whole thing and how often weird they were, and what they had to say chilled me to the core. They said that the man upon arrival seemed to be antagonizing the dogs. They have a Rottweiler mix and a Pitbull mix to see how they would react. They weren't sure why he took this stance, but after me telling them this, we put our stories together. They pointed out how he would stand and stare at the dogs while the woman was acting busy doing absolutely nothing but just moving around. Then they pointed out that the campers sat facing our campsite, and not the lake. They had also noticed that there was minimal interaction between the two of them, and that they had just seemed to keep staring at us. They said one of the dogs would growl occasionally throughout the night, and they didn't get much rest. When I brought up that my boyfriend said they were probably just getting firewood, both of them said, why would they go out of their way to collect firewood that had been heavily rained on? And also, why would they have waited till we went to sleep, and then just pack up the next day and leave? So, this is what I think. I think those people were locals who knew the condition of the campsite and had scoped it out. They noticed our site was reversed and isolated. There was no one else out there but us and them. And there were some other campers pretty far apart. But I think they camped out to either rob us or murder us. And then they heard my boyfriend say something about not shooting them. And them not knowing that all I had was a pepper spray air gun, they backed off. Then they spent the afternoon observing us until they saw us leaving and decided to call things off. Because none of their behavior makes sense. Or am I just crazy? Creepiest Uber driver I've ever encountered, by Kindly Cost. Okay, so this happened a while ago and is pretty mild compared to some of the other stories I've heard. But I do think a lot about it. When it came to getting my driver's license, I was a bit of a late bloomer. Living in the city, however, this wasn't a big deal, as walking, public transport, and rideshare apps were all extremely accessible, and I had no trouble getting where I needed to go. Most of the time, I used Uber to get to work and met a lot of the local Uber drivers, some of which knew me by name. There were a few encounters of drivers creeping me out, but never too badly, so there's only one that really sticks out and scares me to this day. I was maybe 23 at the time, working an office job downtown, and had ordered an Uber to take me home from work. I didn't recognize the driver, but everything was pretty normal at first. I hopped in, said our hellos, and he confirmed the address, and we started driving. The driver was a guy in maybe his mid-30s, heavier set, smiley. He was continually glancing in the rearview mirror at me, more than average. And he nearly immediately told me that he'd picked me up before, which as someone who Ubered almost daily did not strike me as all that odd. But then things he was saying started to get really weird. He asked me why I didn't work at my former job. I was surprised and a little bit alarmed that he'd remembered where I used to work, as I hadn't worked there since I was 19. But he had apparently remembered me from about 3 or 4 years prior. He also remembered my hometown, where I went to high school, college, and what I had studied, how many siblings I had. And he confirmed it all with me like, "You're from blank, right?" Or, "So you went to such and such high school. And you have 2 younger sisters, right? You still studying art history at blank university?" All of this might not sound too odd for an attentive and friendly driver. Except I was never a talkative passenger and usually avoided small talk and kept to myself in Ubers. I have no memory of ever telling any Uber driver this much specific information. And when asked, I would give vague answers like, "Oh, about 40 minutes south," or, "Yeah, I've got some siblings. I'm not close with them, though." Anything to avoid giving details to a stranger who knew my address. So it was extremely weird to me that he remembered such detailed info about me. He then went on to ask a bunch of personal questions, such as my relationship status, what year I had graduated high school, and where I liked to go out with friends. He also knew about my male roommates somehow, and inappropriately asked about my relationship with him. At that point, I was getting extremely uncomfortable, and my answers were becoming more and more curt, but he was not taking the hint. It got to the point where I stopped being cooperative with the questioning at all and just started giving vague one-word answers or pretending not to hear his questions at all until he gave up asking and moved on to another. All in all, he had remembered quite a bit of personal information about me, much of which I had no memory of ever telling him, and he had unabashedly asked for more. Despite my obvious discomfort, he didn't stop questioning me about my personal life for the entirety of the 10-minute drive, all while glancing back at me through the rear view at every opportunity. Towards the end of the ride, he began complimenting me, telling me that my name was pretty and that I was very beautiful and smart, and saying that he hoped we were paired again because I was his favorite rider. Upon approaching my apartment, he asked which door was mine so that I wouldn't get wet. It wasn't raining. Obviously, I told him my landlord's door, but he pulled up to my door anyway. Before he unlocked the door, he turned around to smile at me and said, "This is the longest ride we've taken together," before saying that he had hoped to see me soon and told me to have a good night. I walked around the side of the building and waited for him to leave before immediately reporting him. Thankfully, this was back when Uber had real humans for customer service, and they responded that they would be blocking him from matching with me for future rides, and would be investigating whether he would be allowed to use the app anymore at all. I took the bus for the next few weeks, and I never saw him again. I also never had another Uber ride like that again. It still creeps me out how he knew all that information about me. I'm so glad I've moved since that happened. My Unforgettable Encounter by Rare Inevitable. My story is actually quite a chilling one. It happened a long time ago now and comes from a brief yet highly disturbing encounter. Despite it being brief, it would eventually leave a long-lasting impression on me and will likely remain the most messed up thing I have ever experienced. My story began when I was a 14-year-old boy. To give some context, I was one of those part of the group but not one of the group types. Shy and reserved, I had friends but not much beyond school hours, so when one of my friends wanted me to hang out with her, it made a welcome change to my quiet after-school routine of video games. We walked back to her house from school, and she invited me in. As I walked in, I saw who I quickly assumed was her dad, with his back to me preparing food. This was the first time I'd been introduced to him, and my first impression would quickly be, putting it very mildly, not great at all. As my friend introduced me, he turned around to face me holding a large kitchen knife. Suddenly, he lurched towards me as if he stumbled forward, yelling, "Whoa!" He quickly turned the knife, pushing the handle quite hard into my chest. He then smirked with the eeriest expression on his face and said, "Only joking." My heart was pounding, and inwardly I was freaking out while I tried to nervously laugh it off. I was sure my face clearly said otherwise. My friend just laughed it off as Dad, fooling around, and led me to her living room, but as I sat down, I couldn't shake the uneasy gut feeling I now had. I tried to shake it off and talk to my friend, but her dad promptly entered the living room. They had music playing moderately loud on a stereo, and he cranked the volume to a level that sounded like a live band was in there with us. My friend followed him to the kitchen and soon returned. She told me she had to go to the shops to get something for him and asked if I wanted to wait for her, as it wasn't too far away. Given the rather creepy encounter, my gut instinct was having none of it, and I wouldn't be ignoring it. I quickly got up and left with my friend for the shops. I can't say exactly how the rest of the day went, as I can't remember, but I do know I didn't return to that house again. I wouldn't speak of what happened after that for quite some time, and I chalked it up to just a really freaky interaction, locking it away in my mind. However, it wouldn't end there. the dad would set foot in our house a year later, dropping my friend off at a family party we were having. I didn't interact with him then, though my dad offered him a beer and later recalled how he just stood in a corner alone, watching everyone. I would see my friend's dad for the third time a couple of years later, this time on TV, as the face of a man convicted for the abduction and murder of a woman who went missing a week prior. I stood there right as the story broke. I will never, for as long as I live, forget the sensation of my blood turning to ice in my veins. My parents later commented how they literally saw the color drain from my face at that moment. Yet, in the days that followed, it only got worse. He would go on to confess while in custody to the abduction and murder of a woman who had been missing for 20 years. Following corroborations of things he had previously said, along with expert analysis, it led the police to believe he may have actually been a prolific serial killer. He was soon probed as a potential suspect in almost half a dozen unsolved missing person cases. However, due to a lack of evidence and further confession, his involvement in those remains unclear. My mind still occasionally wanders to that first encounter. Even though his choice of victims seemed to be women, I can't help but think about that music cranked up so loud, how my friend asked me if I wanted to wait for her at the house with him. If I had stayed, what would have happened to me, if anything at all? Was there a part of him that was curious, wondering about switching things up a little? Or was that knife held to my chest truly just the harmless joke of a serial killer? Hey gang, thanks for listening to this episode of Uncle Josh's True Scary Stories. If you have a true scary story of any nature that you'd like to hear narrated on this channel or my podcast, email it to unclejoshtruescarystories@gmail.com. I read them all. If you could do me a favor, please hit that like button, leave a comment below, let me know what you thought of the stories, and maybe even become a subscriber. Hit the notification bell for every time I upload. Follow me on social media, links to that are in the description. And if you'd like to take your support a step further, find a link to my Patreon page and check out my storefront at tpublic.com. Links to both of those are in the description. Everyone, be excellent to each other. And until next time, be wary of things that go bump in the night. It could be anything. A ghost, a monster, or the guy next door.